Team Stimpson, it's your turn to subject yourself to the opposition team's questions. Who wants to start over on this side?
I'll start.
Okay, Mr. D'Souza.
We might disagree on the number of codes, Professor Stimpson, but there's no doubt that these codes exist. And there's not one of them in the entire country that says, in a single line, students shall not yell racial epithets at each other. If the sole objective of these codes was to proscribe overtly racist epithets in speech, why are the codes elastically drawn so that they typically talk about stigmatizing or offensive speech? They talk about criticism of religious conduct or observance. They talk about moral behavior and choice. Words and phrases that are broad-reaching enough that they seem to siphon off a far-reaching debate into very legitimate questions.
Let's talk about what those codes really say again and continue the conversation we began a few minutes ago, Mr. D'Souza. One of the worst of them, and there have been some bad ones, was thrown out of court in 1989. Let me describe what my own institution says, because my own institution is typical. It first says freedom of speech is paramount. We are an educational institution. Inquiry cannot go on without freedom, without healthy and robust debate. And then it says, but we really shouldn't harass each other if harassment means we can't do our work. Now this seems to me a perfectly simple, ethical statement. A college and a university, in all its infinite variety in the United States, is an ethical community. And I really don't imagine, Mr. D'Souza, that you would believe, if you were a dean of students, that one group could go to a student and say, faggot, 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 I'm going to kill you, and say that again and again and again until the student couldn't do his work.
But that case is so rare. We remember the case at Brown University where a student was expelled for yelling racial epithets drunken late at night. The reason that got so much publicity was it was such a freak incident. Much more typical is at Southern Methodist University a few months ago. A student was punished for criticizing Martin Luther King's communist associations. Another student was sentenced to community service for calling his roommate, quote, a Mexican. Do you approve of these verdicts?
If one of the first jobs of intellectuals, journalists, and I would hope TV programs of this quality, is to make sure we have the full and accurate story. And one thing that has happened with the stories of what's going on campuses, both to students and professors, is they have become cartoon headlines. Now, the American Association of University Professors does a very good thing. Whenever there is a report of violation of academic freedom, it sends a team in there, an investigatory team, and they do a thorough investigation, really taking care of due process. And what I have come to believe, seeing the distortions I have seen, which have made me weep for truth, what I would like is a team that goes in and looks at each one of these notable incidents, looks at it carefully, and gets all sides of the story. We really need, I hate to use this expression, I'm going to anyway, I can't resist it. This seems to be a show in which we occasionally fall prey to temptation. I really wish we had a truth squad for some of these headlines about what's going on campus. Life is always more complex than a cartoon.
Thank you. Professor Walters and Mr. D'Souza, you're through.
I'm through. I enjoyed it.
That's good. That means you guys failed. Try to do a little better. Let's see. Mr. D'Souza, would you like to ask some questions of Professor Walters?
Professor Walters, in three important decisions recently, the American society seems to be moving in the direction of allowing greater freedom of expression. The government, for example, funds the photography and photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe. The lyrics of Two Live Crew were vindicated as not being obscene. The Supreme Court has held that it's okay, if you want to burn the American flag. Do you think that these were progressive or reactionary decisions?
Oh, I think to some extent they were progressive decisions, because I think the value that we place on free expression in the society is well known, and I think it's one to be cherished.
Yet in every single case we are talking about views and values, the promulgation of ideas deeply offensive to others, to the community, are ideas that it can be said fracture the bonds which allow society to cohere. So why is it all right to outlaw speech in the university, but quite okay to permit it in society at large? Why should society allow greater freedom than the university?
Well, to begin with, I think that you're overreaching with respect to your comment about outlawing. Nobody is talking about outlawing free speech, either in society or in the university. And secondly, I think in society, as in the university, there is something called the vital center. I think Arthur Schlesinger had it right. It is that vital center, I think, which really holds society together and really makes a societal statement about the veracity of any concept, whether or not the Supreme Court agrees with it. I think that what we have in the university is the same kind of situation. But regardless of the code, there is a consensus on the campus which will determine ultimately what is right and what is wrong.
A number of universities have these specific hate speech ordinances which you said were justified by the rise of racial epithets. Let me suggest a few epithets. At City University of New York, I believe, we've read recently about Professor Leonard Jeffries, who refers to whites as genetically inferior to blacks, who has made derogatory remarks about Jews, for example. I'd like to know if you think he should be prosecuted under these guidelines.
No, I don't think he should be prosecuted. I think because his colleagues at the university have to come together and make that vital consensus to determine what to do about him, and they will make that judgment.
You were an advisor to Jesse Jackson, who was quoted, has been quoted as referring to New York as Jaime Town and to Jews as Jaimes. Do you think that that is the kind of rhetoric that qualifies as an offense under the hate speech prohibitions?
I don't know whether it qualifies as an offense under any particular regime, but I do know that Jews in this country, many of them were deeply offended, and he apologized for that duly, many times.
I was reading the Howard University newspaper recently. I find it full of rhetoric that says things like smash the honky oppressor. That's an actual phrase from a recent issue. Do you think that blacks can be racist against whites, and should persons of color also be liable under the hate speech ordinances?
I think it's very difficult for people who are powerless essentially to be racist, because one has to have the ability to enforce that racism. And by that definition,
I'd like to turn to a couple of specific cases.
Pick one, because you're running out of time.
I'm reading from a document distributed by the American Sociological Association. A professor says, I begin my course with the basic feminist principle that in a racist, classist society, we have all swallowed oppressive ways of being, whether intentionally or not. It is not open to debate whether a white student is racist or a male student is sexist. He, she simply is. Rather, our focus is on the social forces that keep these distortions in place. Do you think that this is a narrowing or a widening of the parameters of debate? And should this professor be prosecuted under the hate speech rule? Because she, after all, is making a general reference to whites as a group, and it's derogatory. She says all whites are racist.
You can answer that question and then go on the offensive, Professor Walker.
No, all right, thank you very much. No, I think in general, when a professor is referring to a class or a group situation and attempting to make a theoretical point, that person should not be subject to any harassment by any authority. I think when you begin to talk about individuals, when you begin to talk about them with the intention of doing harm, either to the individual or to the group, then I think you become liable.
Go ahead, ask her.
I think that when looking at some of my colleagues here and listening to some of the comments they've made about your work, certainly Stanley and others, there is a question about the veracity of much of the information in your work. When you, for example, refer to me, I think it was me because you referred to someone called Ron Johnson as part of a group that was attempting to spur the Howard University student to revolt. There is no Ron Johnson on the faculty because I'm the chairman, and I think I ought to know. And furthermore, I was at the Kennedy School that semester. I wasn't even there. So I'm wondering who it was that you were referring to.
I don't refer to Ron Johnson, but to Alvin Thornton, a professor of political science. I don't implicate you in it at all.
Okay, then I would suggest that people actually read that chapter on Howard University, because there is a Ron somebody there, and it was certainly not me. Secondly, I would like to ask your opinion about something that has recently happened. The Encyclopedia Britannica has just published a 30-volume set, 67,000 pages, and it only includes reference to one black author. and that is actually somebody whom all of you know is not black, and that is St. Augustine. Now, do you think that that was proper?
I think most likely the error about St. Augustine arose out of some fantasy of Afrocentrism that tends to link the achievements of Western civilization as being pirated from Egypt. No, I don't think it's proper because
So
I
then
think
there were
that
no blacks.
I do think that W.E.B. Du Bois, I do think that perhaps Langston Hughes, I do think that Martin Luther King belong in such a list.
But then that's precisely what's going on at American campuses, and that is precisely the situation that many people are trying to correct.
No, it's not. The debate is really not about whether or not books should be included. I believe and have argued that other cultures have produced great works that are worthy of study. The argument is, do we choose books because they're any good, or do we choose books because of the race, the gender, or the sexual habits of the author?
Let me ask you this. As someone who... let me ask you this. As someone who has been championing Western civilization, I would like to know what your concept of this question of civilization is. As someone who, like myself, sat in a classroom for many years and listened to my professors talk glibly about the fact that some people are civilized and others are not. And on the radio this morning, I heard that the Baltics were the civilized part of the Soviet Union. I'm wondering how this concept of Western civilization plays out in your own mind.
Well, I'm not defending the Ancien regime. I wasn't here at the time, and I want no part of it. You're setting up false alternatives. Either we have the intolerance of 50 years ago, or we have the intolerance of the politically correct. That's a false set of choices. I think Western civilization has given us many advancements. It's true that Western civilization has committed great crimes, slavery, segregation, and so on. Unfortunately, many great empires have practiced slavery, and I think one of the distinctive contributions of the West was to initiate the movement for the abolition of slavery, which was then exported abroad.
Now, many of your colleagues have set up this term politically correct. Don't you think that the politically correct regime is the one which has established the present regime of American education, including higher education that we have? And don't you think that the people who are really trying to democratize American higher education are the ones that are attacking the political correct regime?
Well, I think we can't speak at a high level of generality and cliche. We have to look at specific cases. The leading demographers of race relations, the leading scholars who teach in this subject, Professor Reynolds Farley at Harvard is considered the country's leading demographer, for example.
University of
Michigan, he has been forced to cancel a course on race relations because of being repeatedly harassed and terrorized, not just by students. Anyone can argue with a student or engage in debate. Administrators and faculty who use the power of the institution to come down hard on professors and students who trespass on the culture of forbidden questions.
What is this culture of forbidden questions that you want to preserve? I think that when you look at the individuals who are manning the bastions, that really what they represent is a culture of recidivism, a culture of attempting to conserve the political correct regime as it has been passed down to us over 130 years.
I'm afraid that's going to have to be a rhetorical question. Thank you very much, both of you. President John Silber, your turn. And who on the opposition team would like to start? Go ahead.
Oh, I have a very small question for you, President Silber. You say you're a supporter of women's rights, and I'm glad to hear it. But one of the premises of the women's rights movement or feminism is that women should be allowed not only to search for community, but to find their own self, to find their autonomy. So why are you so upset if they ask for mild language changes that makes them feel included and indeed be included in the community of discourse?
Because they don't include themselves in the community of human beings by calling themselves furniture. I think I don't like to see women.
You mean
fight.
words can't have more than one meaning?
I don't like to see women debase the cause of women's rights by such trivial and misguided objectives. I think it is far more important for them to fight for such things as full participation in every profession, as the opportunity to have daycare for their children so that they can combine a career with motherhood, a very important role, a socially essential role, and there's got to be a way that this society can accomplish both. Now, those are the kinds of issues that I thoroughly applaud and support. And this is why I'm very proud that about 28% of the faculty at Boston University are females, and that many are deans and many are department chairmen. Those are the kinds of issues worth fighting for, but not to call yourself a chair.
But are you saying that but the logical consequence of what you say is that culture and language doesn't matter? And I can't imagine you saying that.
Of course, culture and language matters. I don't think that women should be denigrated by the way they're spoken of. That's why I don't like to see them denigrated by referring to them as inanimate objects.
Well, I don't mind being called a chair.
Professor Fish.
Good for you.
In other words, you don't assume... That is, for you, denigration must always be an explicit and easily recognizable act, and therefore you reject the notion, and with it much of the scholarship of the last 40 years, that linguistic assumptions can be so deeply assumed that the society that uses them is not aware of them, and that at some later stage there can be some corrective efforts which may, as one of my colleagues said, seem strange to the ears of those who have labored under another regime, but do respond to something that has been going on in the deep culture of the language.
No, not at all. But what I think you should recognize is that sometimes a political movement gets started or a social movement gets started, and it is characterized by a very high level of mindlessness, and they go off on the wrong track. For example, there is nothing wrong in insisting that a chairwoman be called a chairwoman and not called a chairman. I have no objection to that.
You just called your own department chairman about 30 seconds ago.
Yes, I may have, and I'm glad to see your partisanship here.
May I?
No, I believe that we certainly have to become aware of language. But when you think of the effort that has been made to denude the term man of its application to both men and women,
I like the
and at the same time, one continues to use the word women with men as its suffix, and use person with son, also having a male meaning as a suffix. We can see how trivial, how comical the emphasis on this linguistic reform is. What we should focus on is the reform of things that are absolutely central to the fulfillment of women.
Let me move to that, because you are responsible for a very large and major university, and I assume by taking the position that you've taken, you believe that there is some kind of restriction of freedom of thought that probably is going on, the kind that's been described by your colleagues at Boston University. What do you think the source, and what do you think should be done about it?
Well, I think that it has to be resisted. I think there are definite pressures that go on in every university. Certainly at Boston University, we've had those who have wanted to have the administration assert that we shall respect all forms of sexual, affectional preference. Boston University is not going to do that as long as I'm there, because there are certain forms of sexual preference that are simply unacceptable. And if the idea of working in a university is that there are no standards, that every point of view is equally valid, that one view is as good as another, there's no excuse for the existence of universities.
Dr. Silber,
Very briefly, Professor Walters.
Given the fact that the recent survey has found that only 3% of American universities have anything like politically correct incidents, and over 60% of them have some sort of speech code, don't you think that the people on the right, like the National Association of Scholars, are making much ado about nothing?
No, I don't think they are, because I know the kind of restrictions that exist. Try to have a public discussion of abortion, the issue of abortion, at a university. It will be a continual interruption of any speaker who is offering a serious analysis of what is wrong with abortion. Those who are advocating that abortion should be freely given will be allowed to complete their message without interference. The same is true of a serious discussion of homosexuality,
nothing to do with
of
your
the role
views,
of women.
Professor Silber, but I can't allow you to complete your views without interference. We're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Fish. Professor Fish. Who wants to go fishing? Mr. Buckley.
Mr. Fish, in your many writings, you were once quoted as saying that really you engage in superior fiction, and that the status of that fiction has only the obligation
to be interesting.
Right, demands only that you be interesting, which I can see that you are. To what extent have you been engaging in fiction tonight?
Mr. Buckley, if you know that sentence in my writing so well, then you should know that that sentence has now been characterized by me as the most unfortunate sentence I ever wrote. So that, and one that I repudiated, therefore displaying the considerable academic virtue of being able to change my mind when evidence is proffered to me. So why don't you go on to another question?
Okay. The next question is that you were quoted saying, I want them to do what I tell them to. And later you elucidated and said that I want to be able to walk into any first-rate faculty anywhere and dominate it, shape it to my will. I'm fascinated by my own will.
The easy answer to that, and I hope that you get to ask a real question, is I never said that. The reporter, whose name is Fred Siegel, and wrote, I never said that, and wrote for the New Republic, admitted to me on the telephone when I asked him that I didn't say it in the lecture, I didn't say it in the discussion question.
You're saying the New Republic got this wrong?
Yeah. You bet they got it wrong. And when I asked him when I did say it, he told me that I said it in a conversation afterwards as we were walking out of the room. He couldn't remember what it was about. I never said it, and Mr. Siegel, when he wrote the essay, never identified the occasion, never identified himself. When I suggested that his whole operation at that moment was one of bad faith, he said in a sentence I will never forget, I can live with that.
Let me ask you about something.
Go on to something else. That's a bad question.
Let me ask you about something you perhaps did say, and perhaps you will continue the process of repudiation of public statements attributed to you.
Deconstruction.
This is a statement you made about the National Association of Scholars, a group which in its public charter is committed to high standards and rational debate, which includes several university presidents and professors evidently from across the spectrum. You described this group as racist, sexist, and homophobic.
Right.
Now, you know as well as anyone else that those are three of the most pungent epithets in the language.
That's why I use them.
That's why you use them. Could you give us three concrete examples of racism, sexism, and homophobia? Be very specific on the part of the National Association of Scholars.
I don't have to respond to any requests for three. I can just respond to the question of what I meant by saying that, which I hereby repeat. What I did say, by the way, was that the organization is widely known to be racist, sexist, and homophobic, and I was alerting my colleagues as to the nature of the organization they were being asked to join. What I meant by that was in reference precisely to the high-sounding materials to which you refer. These are materials which declare that we are not against women, we are not against gays, we are not against minorities, we just wish their works to enter by neutral objective standards. And then when the question is asked, where do these neutral objective standards come from, it turns out that they come from the very works and points of view being championed by the members of this organization. So that, although the assertion of no discrimination against these groups is made, a mechanism and a way of thinking is put in place that has that effect. So that on the general principle, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and produces duck-like effects, it's a duck. I say again, it's racist, sexist, and homophobic.
That was an example of deconstructionism at work, I guess.
Professor Fish, I'd like to give you the opportunity to either disassociate yourself from or offer a better defense of the assertion of your colleague that blacks cannot be racist, women cannot be sexist, etc.
I understand the assertion because I've heard it before. The assertion...
Can you defend it?
I don't neither have to... As a teacher and a pedagogue, I neither have to defend it. I think my obligation and the obligation I fulfill to this audience, both here and in the television audience, is to explain it.
Well,
the position is one that asserts a distinction between prejudice as an attitude which persons can have, and of course an attitude which will always, I think, be reprehensible, and racism, which depends on the addition to prejudice of the power to effect true actions of a harmful kind on persons. Now, that's a thesis. It's a thesis that deserves consideration. Perhaps it can be empirically investigated. It is not on its face absurd. And indeed, the whole air with which at least Mr. D'Souza and others present views that are complicated in what have been called here cartoon versions is the entire stock in trade of a certain kind of rhetoric in which absurdities are produced by either under-reporting or under-describing cases or linking them in a series of examples. I fear for Mr. D'Souza's health because his mind can only be filled right now with 4,000 half-detailed anecdotes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fish. President Botstein and Mr. Buckley. Mr. Buckley, you start with the first question to President Botstein.
Ms. Botstein, let me read to you 3 sentences published in the Wall Street Journal a month or so ago by Irving Kristol, and ask you to comment on them. He says, though the educational establishment would rather die than admit it, multiculturalism is a desperate and surely self-defeating strategy for coping with the educational deficiencies and associated social pathologies of young blacks. Did these black students and their problems not exist, we would hear little of multiculturalism. There is no evidence that a substantial number of Hispanic parents would like their children to know more about Simon Bolivar and less about George Washington, or that Oriental parents feel that their children are being educationally deprived because their textbooks teach them more about ancient Greece than about ancient China.
For the risk of abandoning some sort of normal format here, my reaction to that is this, that I think that the comments are on some level mean-spirited. That is to say, I don't think that that to raise the issue that multiculturalism is the wrong strategy or a false strategy or really doesn't help the problem. There's a lot of nonsense that goes under the name of multiculturalism. There's no question about it. But there's a lot of nonsense that goes on under every label in the American Academy. But what is the case is that when you change the curriculum in order to make teaching more effective, you raise a very important question. I'm not sure whether it is essential that in order to inspire black students, Asian students, to learn, to foster inquiry, you need to have, quote, role models in the curriculum. That is to say, one has to have a mirror image between what's in the curriculum and the student who is learning.
Well, let me ask you...
I wouldn't defend that proposition because I think that's a very primitive notion. I think actually what would make a person learn how to read is a black classroom where would be a lot of racism.
I would be surprised if a primitive thought was generated by Irving Kristol. But anyway, he says most Hispanics are behaving very much like the Italians of yesteryear, most Orientals like the Jews of yesteryear. Because of differences in cultural background, their integration into American society proceeds at different rates, but it does proceed. The process is not without pain and turmoil, but it works. Ironically and sadly, he says, it has not worked so well for American blacks among the earliest arrivals, hence out of desperation the turn to multiculturalism. Now, this is a thesis by somebody who certainly can't be accused of any tendentious ideas about race.
Because it overlooks one thing. All the other groups he names came here in some level of voluntarism. The only group that came here in slavery are the black Americans. Therefore, there's a distinction between an involuntary minority and voluntary minorities. Therefore, the fact is that you cannot compare, making these comparisons between other immigration groups and the American black.
This isn't an exercise in etiology. It's an exercise in differences of reaction, of acculturation.
But acculturation...
These differences, says he, generated something called multiculturalism, where people would kill in order to prove that some unknown Abyssinian was a better poet than John Milton.
But that's not what multiculturalism is. I mean, that's a character of multiculturalism. America has always been multicultural. What happened to the melting pot? How is it now that a Jewish author such as Saul Bellow is in the canon?
As Mr. Fish will tell you, the melting pot is out of favor because people ought nowadays to accentuate that which distinguishes them from the American.
The melting pot was always not an acculturation to some kind of bland center, but always a tension between difference and sameness. The fact is that American, white or black, or Hispanic or Asian, in this day and age, requires to know much more about non-Western cultures than we might have thought 30 or 40 years ago. And that, in fact, putting in non-Western components into what goes under multiculturalism is a perfectly reasonable proposition.
Well, 87% of the American college students don't take courses in American culture. So wouldn't you say that there might be an argument to give that a kind of priority which it is not nowadays receiving?
I believe the priority goes to that which will reverse the severe anti-intellectualism, the low standards, and the absence of motivation that exists in most American college students.
But aren't we
whatever works,
I'm
in favor of.
I know. Aren't we losing that because of the ideologization of culture as has been so, I think, amply demonstrated by the data that
But the
we've given
culture
you.
was also always ideologized. When the immigrants you spoke about came to the United States, there was much more talk about a Christian nation. And when Jews, and there was you even derided, when in fact we left the religion out, it was to respond to new populations who found the imposition of a tacit state religion as offensive. We always adapt to the new populations that come to the United
Mr. Botstein, go on the attack.
I'm so far in the defensive, how can I take the attack? I was never much in military matters. My question back to you, Mr. Buckley, is this, that what I suspect in the position that all of you have taken is not so much that you fear for freedom. What you really fear is that some things you believe in, deeply believe in, as having to be taught, a culture, talk about acculturation, you brought it up. That which you want Americans to enter into, a set of values, a set of expectations, is under siege on some level, through what is going on in the university. I agree, absolutely. For example, that...
Was that your question? Did
yes.
you agree?
Yeah. Go ahead. I was going to slip in a statement, but I pulled back.
Obviously, the phenomena on which we are training our attention are those phenomena within universities in which there is the kind of tension which we think is leading no place. On the contrary, we think is making things worse. You, I know, because I know your work, share a certain fear that progress is not being made in the direction we both desire. Now, we have to ask ourselves the questions, what is this mandarinate that has been formed in the cultural centers, like the Modern Language Association, that says that Carol Ione cannot be named to the National Endowment for the Humanities? Why? Because, in fact, she criticized certain people who got certain prizes, which went against feminist ideology. Where the protests that call this rank anti-intellectualism? Has there been a protest on your campus over such an extremity as that?
Well, it seems to me that the opposition of someone to become on the National Endowment Council is a very sensible protest. There have been protests for every single appointment because there are interest groups on both sides of the issue who want money. It's not an extremist act. It's a perfectly self-interested act that has existed in every political issue.
Historically, she's the first person who hasn't been confirmed.
Well, it seems to me that...
So it's not all that traditional.
Well, it is traditional that there have been always. I would say that there has never been a time when the American Academy has not been political. There has always been a political consensus in the American Academy. What's happening is that political consensus is changing.
Well, if it is indeed changing, what is the mandate that governs that change, and who should participate in it? When we have somebody like Professor Silber, who is running a university, certain voices get heard that don't get heard in places like Stanford, where we overthrow the compulsory course in Western civilization and get something blander. The forces that compel this are not forces that you approve of, are they?
No, I would agree with you that one thing that we do have is a lot of cowardice, lack of good leadership, and some aimlessness in what people seek from the university. But I don't think it can be put at the foot of particular groups, whether they be African Americans, blacks, Asians, women, or the desire to change the curriculum in the direction of a more diverse set of materials.
Well, if those aren't the propulsive forces, is it simply as simple as saying, well, after all, as has been said, the majority of the world is colored, i.e. of colored skin, and under the circumstances, we have to develop a cultural and intellectual amalgam in America that reflects that fact. This is very different from the notion of American intellectual and cultural exceptionalism, is it not?
Yeah, but what I think you're seeing is a species of the absence of curiosity on most entering college students, because of the way they've been trained in high school. I think you're looking at symptoms of a general educational failure much more than the result of any kind of nefarious plot or conspiracy on certain groups that intimidate others. I don't think the situation has deteriorated. What has happened is the situation has changed dramatically, that a consensus that we imagined once existed has disappeared and no new consensus has taken its place. I think that's actually quite creative. I think with all the nonsense that's gone on, the cartoon, there's been a tremendous amount of new interest in fields, studies, and areas which perhaps can rescue the issue of standards which have fallen so low.
I look forward to the fruits of that endeavor.
Thank you very much, both of you.